Novak Djokovic defaults 2020. The 2020 US Open was unlike anything tennis had seen before. The atmosphere was strange, almost eerie, with empty stands and echoes bouncing through Arthur Ashe Stadium where the usual roar of a New York crowd should have been. The players were navigating not only opponents, but also strict pandemic protocols. Every match carried the feeling of playing in isolation, with only the sound of ball against strings and the occasional clap from officials breaking the silence. In this odd backdrop, the tournament delivered one of the most shocking exits in Grand Slam history. Novak Djokovic entered as the clear favorite, ranked #1 in the world, undefeated that season, and looking as unshakable as ever. Many assumed he would cruise to another slam. His form was sharp, and he hadn't dropped a set through his first 3 matches. But then came his 4th round meeting with Pablo Carreño Busta, and everything changed in a matter of seconds. Late in the first set, after losing his serve, frustration boiled over. Djokovic swatted a ball behind him, casually but carelessly. The ball struck a line judge directly in the throat. She collapsed, coughing and holding her neck as officials rushed to her aid. The moment froze time. Djokovic, realizing instantly what happened, sprinted toward her, his face written with shock. Yet intent didn't matter. The rule book was unforgiving. Any player who strikes an official, deliberately or not, faces automatic default. There was no debate, no wiggle room. The chair umpire and tournament referee gathered, and within minutes, the announcement came. Djokovic was disqualified from the US Open. The world #1, who seemed destined to extend his slam count, was suddenly gone. His walk off the court, mask covering his face, head lowered, was haunting in its finality. No chance to recover, no appeal, just silence, then disbelief. With Djokovic out, the draw cracked open. Dominic Thiem seized it, storming to his first Grand Slam title. But even Thiem's triumph couldn't erase the memory of that single moment when one swing of frustration changed the entire shape of the tournament. A champion undone not by an opponent, but by his own impulse. The snapshot of Djokovic leaving Ashe in the quiet of 2020 remains one of the most unforgettable scenes the US Open has ever witnessed. Jimmy Connors' run at 39, 1991. The 1991 US Open belonged to Jimmy Connors. Not in the literal sense, he didn't win the trophy, but in the emotional sense, he owned the stage. At 39 years old, well past the point when most players had long retired, Connors turned back the clock in a way that stunned fans and opponents alike. For years, Connors had battled surgeries, nagging injuries, and whispers that he was finished. Entering the Open, hardly anyone expected him to make a dent in the draw. Then came opening night against Patrick McEnroe. The match started brutally. Connors dropped the first 2 sets and looked slow, weary, and overmatched. But what followed became the spark of a legend. He clawed back, feeding on the crowd's energy, playing each point as if it were his last. 5 grueling sets later, Connors completed the comeback. Arthur Ashe Stadium erupted like it hadn't in years, and suddenly an entire city was behind him. That first win lit the fire. From then on, Connors seemed to tap into a reservoir of spirit and stubbornness that only he possessed. He upset Michael Stick, the reigning Wimbledon champion, pulling off impossible shots and throwing his fists into the air as if he were a man half his age. Every point became theater. Connors didn't just hit winners. He celebrated them with a raw intensity that electrified New York. The fans weren't just watching. They were part of the fight, rising to their feet, chanting, roaring with every rally. The deeper he went, the more the tournament turned into a spectacle built around him. Quarterfinals, semifinals, each stage carried the feel of a farewell tour, and a miracle rolled into one. Connors' run ended against Jim Courier in the semifinals. But by then, it hardly mattered. The story had already been written. A 39-year-old icon, playing on heart and grit, had given tennis one of its greatest underdog stories of the century. It wasn't a trophy that defined Connors' 1991 US Open. It was the spirit of defiance. Against time, against expectations, against the limits of his body, Connors reminded the world what made him unforgettable. In New York, on those nights in September, he wasn't just competing. He was proving that belief, fire, and sheer will can turn even the most unlikely run into a piece of sports history. Federer upset by Del Potro, 2009 final. Roger Federer walked into the 2009 US Open final chasing history. He had won the last 5 US Opens in a row, and he was the heavy favorite to make it 6. Across the net was Juan Martín Del Potro, just 20 years old, talented but raw, facing his first Grand Slam final. Few thought he could actually stop Federer on that stage. For most of the match, it looked like the script would play out as expected. Federer took control early and had his chances to close it out. But Del Potro didn't fade. He blasted forehand after forehand, some of the hardest the sport has ever seen. He stood toe-to-toe with Federer, absorbing the pressure and answering with sheer power. The match stretched into 5 sets, and the longer it went, the more Federer looked frustrated. His serve faltered, his composure slipped, and Del Potro kept swinging freely. When the final point ended, the young Argentine had pulled off a stunning upset. Federer's streak was over, and Del Potro had his first and still only Grand Slam title. The twist wasn't just the upset, it was the way it happened. Federer wasn't outplayed start to finish. He had chances to win, but Del Potro ripped the match out of his hands with fearless hitting. It was one of those nights where a rising star broke through by toppling a giant, and it left the stadium cheering. Andy Murray breaks through. 2012 final. By 2012, Andy Murray had carried the weight of British tennis for years. He had lost 4 Grand Slam finals already, and each time the story was the same. Close, but not enough. The pressure only grew heavier after he lost to Federer in the Wimbledon final earlier that summer, leaving him in tears on center court. But then came the 2012 US Open. Murray stormed through the draw to set up a final against Novak Djokovic. The match was a war. It stretched to 5 sets, full of long rallies, brutal baseline battles, and swings of momentum that left everyone drained. Murray took the first 2 sets, Djokovic clawed back to even it, and suddenly it felt like the Scot might once again fall just short. Instead, Murray found something extra in the deciding set. He steadied himself, refused to blink, and finally crossed the line. The moment he won, he dropped to the court, exhausted and emotional. For Britain, it was historic. Their first male Grand Slam champion in 76 years. For Murray, it was the release of years of pressure and heartbreak. This wasn't just a title. It was proof that he belonged at the very top, and it set the stage for the rest of his career. It was not that Murray was talented enough to win, everyone knew that, but that he finally overcame the weight of expectation on one of tennis's biggest stages. Dominic Thiem's comeback, 2020 final. The 2020 US Open final will always be remembered as one of the most dramatic nights in modern tennis. The entire tournament had already been marked by unusual circumstances. No fans in the stands, players operating under strict pandemic restrictions, and an atmosphere that felt more like a surreal exhibition than the grandeur of a Grand Slam. Against this backdrop came a showdown between 2 men desperate to claim their first major, Dominic Thiem and Alexander Zverev. From the opening game, Zverev looked like the one ready to seize his moment. He blasted serves, ripped forehands, and rushed the net with confidence that made him appear untouchable. He swept through the first 2 sets in dominant fashion, leaving Thiem looking flat and almost overwhelmed. A straight sets victory seemed inevitable. Zverev's power was simply too much, and the scoreboard reflected what everyone believed. The German was about to become a Grand Slam champion. But then came the shift. Thiem, who had lost 3 previous Slam finals, refused to accept another defeat. He tightened his game, stopped overhitting, and forced Zverev into longer exchanges. Slowly, point by point, the Austrian began dragging the match into a grind. The 3rd set went his way. Not with brilliance, but with grit. The 4th followed a similar script. Zverev's confidence cracked, and Thiem's stubborn refusal to disappear brought the contest to a 5th set. By then, it was no longer about talent. Both men looked exhausted, their bodies barely cooperating. Thiem limped between points, his legs shot. Zverev's arm grew heavy, his once lethal serve suddenly unreliable. The match turned into a war of nerves, each player fumbling as much as they fought. When the 5th set reached a deciding tiebreak, the tension was unbearable. Neither man looked capable of finishing, but somebody had to. In those final exchanges, Thiem found just enough strength to push through. His shots weren't pretty, but they were brave. Zverev, so close to glory, faltered with double faults and tentative strokes. When his last shot flew long, Thiem dropped to the court, overwhelmed with relief more than joy. History had been made. He became the first man in the Open era to recover from 2 sets down to win the US Open final. John McEnroe disqualification, 1990. If Thiem's triumph was about resilience, John McEnroe's 1990 US Open exit was about implosion. McEnroe had long been the sport's most infamous firebrand. Supremely talented, endlessly entertaining, and perpetually angry. For over a decade, he had shouted his way through matches, creating as many headlines for his temper as for his victories. But in the 4th round against Mikael Pernfors, the sport finally caught up with him. The match itself started ordinarily enough. McEnroe still had flashes of brilliance, But the years had taken some edge off his game. What hadn't dulled was his temper. In the early stages, he picked up a code violation for glaring at a linesman. The tension rose when he smashed his racket in frustration, earning a second violation. For most of McEnroe's career, such antics might have been tolerated. But in 1990, the officials had been instructed to enforce the rules strictly. That meant the margin for his outbursts had evaporated. When he turned his fury on the chair umpire, it was the final straw. His tirade, filled with the classic McEnroe venom, crossed the line one time too many. The referee stepped in, and the unthinkable happened. McEnroe was defaulted. The announcement stunned the crowd. The former champion, the man who had once owned New York's hard courts, was out. Not beaten by Pernfors, but by his inability to rein in his temper. It was the first time in the Open era that a player of McEnroe's stature had been disqualified from the tournament. His walk off the court was surreal. This wasn't the heroic exit of a fading legend, but the collapse of a combustible personality who had pushed the rules too far. For fans, it was both shocking and fitting. McEnroe had built his career on the edge, and in 1990, the edge finally cut back. His default left a hole in the event, but it also sealed his legacy as tennis's ultimate rebel. Some remembered the artistry of his volleys, others the explosions that defined him. Either way, the 1990 US Open reminded the world that John McEnroe could never be separated from chaos. Serena Williams versus Naomi Osaka, 2018 final. The 2018 women's final was supposed to be a celebration. Naomi Osaka, a rising star, had powered her way to her first major final. Across the net was Serena Williams, chasing her record-tying 24th slam. The match was already historic before a single ball was struck. What happened instead was chaos that overshadowed the tennis itself. Early in the match, Serena was hit with a code violation for receiving coaching from her box. She protested, furious, insisting she would never cheat. Later, frustration boiled over, and she smashed her racket, earning another violation. The situation spiraled. When she called the umpire a thief for taking a point from her, she was given a game penalty. The stadium erupted in noise, confusion, and divided loyalties. Through it all, Osaka kept her focus. She played calm, powerful tennis and won the match in straight sets, earning her first Grand Slam. Yet the moment was drowned in controversy. As the trophy ceremony began, Osaka covered her face with her visor, overwhelmed by boos from the crowd. Serena, to her credit, tried to calm the moment, telling the fans to cheer for the champion. It was supposed to be Osaka's coronation, but it became one of the most emotionally charged finals in US Open history. The young star lifted the trophy in tears, and the night ended not with celebration, but with the uneasy feeling that something pure had been spoiled by conflict. The Seals stabbing, 1993. Some shocks arrive not during a match, but in the silence that follows. Monica Seles was the brightest star of the early 1990s, a teenager with 9 Grand Slam titles before her 20th birthday. Then, in 1993, everything shattered in Hamburg when a spectator ran onto the court and stabbed her in the back. Seles survived, but the trauma kept her away from tennis for more than 2 years. When she finally returned, the sport had shifted, and her dominance was gone. By the time she stood again on the hard courts of New York in 1995, the US Open was waiting for her. Crowds roared louder for her than for anyone else that summer. Every step she took back on Arthur Ashe felt like a victory in itself. She reached the final that year, falling to Steffi Graf, but the moment wasn't about losing or winning. It was about the return. A young champion, nearly stolen from the game by violence, coming back to stand under the lights. The US Open became the place where she proved to herself and the world that she could still belong. That lingering pain never fully left. Seles continued to compete, even making another final in 1996. But the knife in Hamburg had altered her career forever. The applause wasn't just for forehands and backhands. Emma Raducanu's fairy tale run, 2021. The 2021 US Open felt routine at the start. Familiar names filled the draw, favorites advanced early, and no one predicted that a teenager ranked outside the top 100 would rewrite history. Then Emma Raducanu appeared. Qualifiers usually sneak in, maybe win a round, then fade. Raducanu didn't fade, she became the story of the entire tournament. From her very first match, she played with freedom. Her ground strokes were clean, her movement sharp, her confidence shocking for someone who had never played in Arthur Ashe before. She won one match, then another, and the disbelief grew with each victory. The deeper she went, the more the New York crowd wrapped itself around her. By the second week, the buzz wasn't about Djokovic's chase for a calendar slam or established stars. It was about this teenager who didn't seem to understand the weight of the stage. Raducanu breezed past opponents who had years more experience. She didn't drop a single set in 10 matches, from qualifying all the way to the final. There she met Leylah Fernandez, another teenager on her own dream run. The final wasn't perfect, but Raducanu kept her nerve when it mattered most. She closed it out 6-4, 6-3, falling to the ground in shock, the first qualifier in history to win a Grand Slam. She had gone from unknown to champion in 3 weeks. Serena Williams' foot fault. 2009 semifinal. Serena Williams has delivered countless legendary moments in New York. But the 2009 semifinal against Kim Clijsters is remembered for one of the most shocking finishes in tennis history. It wasn't about a stunning rally or an incredible comeback. It ended because of a single foot fault. Serena was serving to stay in the match, already down a set and facing match point. Her second serve landed, but the lineswoman called a foot fault. That gave Clijsters the point, which also happened to be the match. Serena, already boiling with frustration, exploded. She marched toward the official, unleashing a furious outburst that would live forever on replay. The rules were clear. Verbal abuse meant a code violation. And since it came on match point, the violation ended the contest. Just like that, a Grand Slam semifinal ended not with a ball in play, but with a penalty. The stadium was stunned. Clijsters looked confused, and Serena stood fuming, trying to argue her case as fans tried to process what they had seen. It was one of those rare moments when tennis ended without tennis deciding it. Clijsters would go on to win the title that year, completing her comeback after time away from the sport. A champion brought down not by her opponent's winners, but by her own misstep at the service line, and an eruption that the rulebook could not ignore.